March 2020, when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, the immediate focus was on the threat to public health. And for good reason. COVID was scary, lethal, we had little understanding of it, and no vaccines. But at my organization, the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, we were also immediately worried about the threat that COVID posed to civic space. ICNL is an international organization that's worked for decades to improve the laws that affect civil society and core civic freedoms like freedom of association, assembly, and expression. We've seen how governments responding to other kinds of crises, like terrorism, have invoked broad emergency powers and often overreached in restricting rights and freedoms. So we were worried about the potential for the COVID crisis to be similarly misused. We also recognized the need for information about how the legal environment for civic freedoms was changing during COVID to help people around the world understand the human rights dimension of this crisis. Working quickly, just days after the WHO's pandemic announcement, we launched the COVID-19 Civic Freedom Tracker. Information on the tracker is crowdsourced from a global network of ICNL staff, our European affiliate, the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law, UN Special Rapporteur Vanilla Lane, and civil society partners around the world. They have been the first line of research and data collection. I'll note that the tracker is pretty low-tech. It started out as an Excel sheet that we populated with information on new emergency decrees and laws, including data on the type of law, when it was adopted, the impact of the law on civic freedoms, and so forth. Each entry was vetted at several levels by ICNL's legal and research staff. A few days after starting the project, our web developer created an online platform to display the information. The platform is simple. It's built on WordPress and essentially displays the data as a visual. For each measure, once the information has been vetted and validated, ICNL's research team enters it from the Excel into this online form, and it appears in the tracker online. From the tracker website, you can click on the map to find out what has happened in a certain country, or you can search by the date, the issue area, or the type of measure, whether it was a law or another form of government action. Also, since the tracker is focused on legal responses, new emergency laws, decrees, and the like, we've included a link to the primary source documents wherever possible. Since March 2020, the tracker has helped raise awareness of a kind of parallel pandemic. Nearly 650 different measures in 178 countries that affect human rights and civic space. For instance, we've seen 112 countries declare an emergency. Why is this a concern? Many emergency declarations activate disproportionate government power and may enable rights abuses. For example, when the King of Malaysia declared a state of emergency during COVID, it gave the government almost complete immunity for rights violations. Once an emergency declaration is in place, the powers it activates tend to become permanent. Indeed, many COVID emergency declarations didn't have clear expiration dates or mechanisms for review. We've also seen over 60 countries adopt COVID measures that chill free expression and can be used to penalize dissent. Often under the guise of targeting disinformation related to the virus, many countries have enacted new criminal penalties for quote-unquote fake news through laws that are often broadly drafted to cover criticism of the government. We've also tracked measures that limit freedom of assembly, that is, folks' ability to engage in protests and demonstrations. These include over 130 countries that banned mass gatherings of people. And while that may make some sense when you're talking about a contagious disease, many bans have been absolute, with no exception for socially distanced protests. And in several countries, the timing has been interesting. In Algeria, Israel, and Thailand, for instance, officials introduced assembly bans regarding COVID at the same time as governments were facing widespread opposition protests. Finally, we've tracked at least 56 countries that adopted new, far-reaching surveillance powers and introduced new mandatory tracking and tracing systems in the name of fighting COVID. The ostensible and legitimate purpose is for contact tracing, but not all of these measures have clear safeguards. It's not always clear that these measures are temporary or that the data will be used only for the COVID emergency. We've already seen authorities in China, for instance, using their COVID tracking system to monitor human rights activists and restrict their travel. With the onset of COVID, hundreds of these new challenges for civic space cropped up around the world. The tracker allows users to see the bigger picture of these trends, converting a massive data set into something that can be more easily understood and interpreted. By making data more accessible, the trackers helped raise awareness about how this global health crisis has enabled a global crisis for civic space. It's been cited by the New York Times, Reuters, BBC, and others, as well as by UN agencies officials, and leaders. But perhaps more importantly, the trackers helped our local partners in civil society understand pandemic-related measures in their countries and push back where governments have overreached. From Rwanda to Indonesia, ICNL has supported partners to carry out public awareness campaigns based on tracker data, to build knowledge among civil society and decision makers about new laws and rules being adopted during COVID and how they affect human rights. We've also supported our partners' efforts to push back on abusive measures identified by the tracker, helping partners from Nigeria to Nicaragua advocate against COVID measures that unduly restrict rights and freedoms. COVID is not the first global public health emergency, and it won't be the last. It's essential that civil society remains vigilant and informed about threats to civic space, even in crisis situations. Tech-based tools like the tracker can make it possible to quickly convey complex information to broad audiences and help keep civic space healthy.